inward. Turning your attention inward first to your breathing. Feel this flow of life. Feel the inward and outward movement and allow it to take on its own natural rhythm. Let the universe breathe through you effortlessly. Focusing your attention only on your breathing right now. Moving your attention inward more deeply. I invite you to think of a word that symbolizes for you the divine reality. Be something as simple as God or love, or even a short phrase. Simply allow the word or the phrase to emerge from within you in your awareness. And as it emerges, simply openly, open-hearted, open-minded, open-souled, repeat the word. Allow it to repeat in your mind at its own pace. You may repeat the word or phrase in rhythm with your breathing at first. You're setting your heart, your love on the divine, not willing but allowing, letting the prayer, letting the word or phrase repeat itself in your awareness, in your heart. Let the divine presence unfold in your feeling, in your mind, effortlessly, naturally. Your only intention, lovingly inviting this higher nature, this deeper reality to come into your awareness as you gently, openly repeat word or phrase that symbolizes the divine presence for you. So now together in this time, each one is feeling the presence of the divine within. This awareness of the divine presence we recognize is in each one of us, and we are connected, unified at the deepest level by this source, this reality of being, is beyond words and beyond thought. Yet we are knowing right now. So we bring our attention back first to our breathing, then to our surroundings, gratefully acknowledging that here we are in unity, unity of the divine presence. And all that is unfolding now and our experience is a manifestation of that divine presence, divine mind, spirit. We trust that we will get just what we need in this flow of spirit in our experience. We are grateful for that truth. We accept it and claim it now, and so it is. Amen. Right. So, in our last few sessions, we've been taking a look at ideas from the spiritual thread that runs through the world and through the ages that we call mysticism. And a course like this, it's a sampler course. I'm not trying to mention or fully describe every mystic or even any of the particular ones that we focus on. We're just sampling. We're looking at some of the fundamental ideas and how they've been expressed in these different traditions and how they are connected. So we've gotten into what I'm calling the third millennium of mysticism, starting in about 1200, and ready to pick that up next and just see how far we get. So I'm going to do a little screen share as I've been doing. And there we go. And let's see. That. So part two, because we started last week. All right. So the first little slide I have here is Eastern Orthodox mystic, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Gregory Palamas. You see from his dates there. And I chose this particular passage from Gregory because I find it very interesting that his teaching, he's teaching beginners, as he says. He's actually talking to one of his students who will be a teacher of beginners, teaching them how to do contemplation. What's the sort of the starting point? And so he says, teach beginners in particular to look within themselves and to bring their intellect within themselves by means of their breathing. So this immediately suggested to me the teaching of the 8 limbs of yoga. In the 8 limbs of yoga, once you get past the first 2 limbs are have to do with practices and the things that you abstain from, the basically kind of moral teachings and moral practice, moral ideas, and then that's followed by posture, the actual meditation part, where you're sitting. So yoga, you have the various postures for meditation. He doesn't go into postures here, but then that's followed by is first pranayama, which is observing the breathing, which in Hinduism turned into a whole system of different practicing different patterns of breathing. It's like a whole um, uh, it's like a whole sort of school of thought, I guess you could say, a system, set of practices to attain various states of consciousness. So one might breathe in through one nostril and out through the other, for example, and hold it for a certain amount of time and all that sort of thing. But in the original yogic teachings, the word pranayama basically means observing the breath. So it's a watching of the breath. We might call it a practice that could also be done in mindfulness meditation in Buddhism, right? So he's telling them to simply bring themselves within, focusing on their breath. And the next part of in the yoga system is called Pratyahara, which is withdrawing the attention from the outer to the inner, drawing the attention away from the world of the senses and what we call the external world to the inner world. Okay, so what he says is recommend them to pay attention to the exhalation and inhalation of their breath, to restrain it a little so that while they are watching it, the intellect too may be held in check. So part of the idea here is, as in yoga, is to keep the mind from wandering, or also as in mindfulness yoga, keep the mind from wandering. That's what he means by watching the intellect, that it may be held in check. So he doesn't want people, as they're contemplating, to have their minds wandering all over the place. And that's why the attention is drawn inward, and they're focusing just on their breath. So that's all that they're aware of. Okay. Then what happens? Well, this they should do until they advance with God's help to a higher stage and are able to prevent their intellect from going out to external things, to keep it uncompounded and to gather into what St. Dionysius calls a state of unified concentration. So this is almost exactly, the yogic practice of meditation or concentration, yogic meditation. In yogic meditation, the idea is it usually is to choose an idea, a name for God, a part of the body, just any number of things one can choose to focus attention fully on in order to, and the idea in yoga is as you focus on whatever it is you've chosen, you will eventually find there's no separation between the idea, what you're focusing on, and yourself. So you can become fully absorbed in the reality of what the idea, the word, the object represents, its essence, its divine substance, and that's how the consciousness merges with the divine. So in the Eastern Orthodox tradition that Gregory is a part of, one of the common things that they would use as the point of concentration is what they call the Jesus prayer. And the Jesus prayer is not the Lord's prayer, but rather a prayer that comes from one of Jesus's parables, the tax collector and the Pharisee parable. And the Pharisee sits up in the corner, you might recall in that story, and he prays, "God have mercy on me, a sinner." That's what they call the Jesus prayer. So they might pray, "God have mercy on me, a sinner," or "Lord Jesus, have mercy on me, a sinner." And the idea in this practice, and this is part of the whole Eastern Orthodox mystical practice, the idea is really quite simply an invitation to receive an invitation, or a prayer for, I guess you could say, for grace, to realize divine love. And the part about being a sinner is a sort of recognition of humility, of the sort of the limitations of human consciousness. And so, in any case, there's a whole teaching around this that we could go into. But here, Gregory makes the fundamental point, and he refers back to St. Dionysius. You might recall we talked about Dionysius, the Areopagite. I mentioned a while back, actually, we were talking about 6th century mysticism, but the writings of Dionysius were extremely important and influential work on that developed mystical practices within Christianity. And it's just interesting, he calls this state unified concentration. And unified concentration is probably as good a definition of what samadhi is in the yogic practices. The mind is entirely focused on, absorbed in the idea of the divine in some way. So this, I find this fascinating, that this description of prayer is so close to those limbs of yoga. You can see that, and it's also, if you think about it, if you go into a unity church, as we did this, or as the meditation we did this morning, very often the meditation might begin, just take a deep breath. Right, it's almost the first thing we focus on is that. How many of you have heard that in a prayer time? Let's just take a deep breath, right? So focus on the breath. We find a comfortable position, the asana, and then mind gets focused on God in some way. Now, a lot of times in unity, there will be multiple affirmations and statements of truth and that sort of thing. In the mystical practice, what one focuses on could be a series of affirmations, but it could just as easily be one word, one syllable, even, okay? Or even one image, right? So the point is the focusing of consciousness, and I want to say the theory, or if I can put it this way, the metaphysics of it is, if God is all in all and God is the substance of everything, then anything you concentrate on, if you become fully absorbed in its substance or in its essence, what you are absorbed in is the divine presence. So in a way, it doesn't matter what you focus on in this system, right? That's kind of what they teach in yoga. And in Christian tradition, there's usually a prayer or a word anyway that one initially focuses on, or many words that one focuses on, um, in order to attain that state of absorption or samadhi or unified concentration, as he calls it here. So now, um, as we kind of look at some of the other statements, um, if you see anything that's familiar to you or that you want to comment on, if you will just unmute yourself and start talking, I'll be quiet and let you complete whatever it is you want to say. Because again, I can't always see what everybody's doing. But do you see how this 13th century mystic is talking about the same thing? Here he is in I think he was in Turkey. I'm sorry, I forget exactly where Gregory was, but he Greece, somewhere at the Eastern Orthodox thing. In 13th century Europe, he's describing the same process that Patanjali described in second century India, right? So it's a really clear sort of description of a method. And so, does this? I would just ask this question: do you find that in your time of prayer and meditation that you do something like this almost naturally,
Oh,
or that you've been taught to do something like this? Maya's nodding yes.
yeah,
Anybody?
we
Anybody
do
else?
do this. Yeah, yeah. I think at our noon meditation, we do a simplified but a very consistent meditation practice. And it includes this, watching your inhalation and then watching your exhalation and not making much more out of it, just being observant and coming to. But I have a question.
Okay.
Where where was he in relation to Rome with this teaching?
Oh, okay. So 13th century, it's part of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. It's after the Great Schism between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. Uh, but Gregory is, I believe, Gregory is acknowledged as a saint in Catholicism as well as in Eastern Orthodoxy. So they have some overlap. The two traditions had, the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic tradition had some significant differences, but most of the differences really were relatively minor. But I suppose the most significant difference was that the Catholic Church acknowledged the Pope as sort of the supreme bishop of the church and the ultimate authority, and they added things like his infallibility and all that sort of thing. Because the Eastern Orthodox Church never had somebody like that. The bishop of Jerusalem was usually, sort of highly regarded and especially regarded because of where he was, but he didn't have any particular authority to make pronouncements about doctrines or any of those sorts of things. The authority of the church was considered to be shared by everyone, all believers, right? In a way, sort of like Protestantism. So the bishops were supposed to represent their location, their whatever the region was that they were overseeing, but they were also supposed to represent the spirituality and the beliefs of their people. And so you have councils of bishops, but you don't have some sort of preeminent authoritative figure in Eastern Orthodoxy. So in terms of the structure of religion, uh, it's completely different than Catholicism. And another thing that's interesting about the Eastern Orthodox Church is um, they didn't believe in establishing any doctrines or any dogmas that they could not justify from Scripture. And as a consequence, they don't have all these different dogmas about Mary, because the dogmas about Mary, as an example, the Catholic Church has the idea of the ascension of Mary. It's not biblical, therefore, or the assumption of Mary. It's not biblical, therefore, it's not part of their dogma. Her perpetual virginity, that the Catholic Church has a doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. They don't have that teaching in the Eastern Church because it's not biblical. They also recognize James as the brother of Jesus rather than the cousin. They take what the Bible says, these are Jesus's brothers. They take it that those, in fact, were his brothers, and that's part of their tradition. So I guess you could say they're more biblical, and they also have kind of more of an emphasis on having a personal experience of God through mysticism than in Catholicism. It's always been this or that saint or individual, but the emphasis has really been on the sacrament as the medium for salvation, and personal, individual, mystical experience has always been, has been somewhat suspect within Catholicism. So yeah, there's differences, but there's a lot of a lot of rituals and icons and all those sorts of things in the Eastern Orthodox Church that might seem very familiar to someone who's a Catholic or somebody who's what they call high Protestant church. It's like Anglicans or some like high Lutheran worship and that sort of thing. So yeah, so that's in his time. There's a split between kind of the authorities and the structure of the churches, but not as much of a division as far as some of the beliefs and even the mysticism. The two different traditions.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a good question. Anybody else have anything they wanted to say?
Well, I got a little something because you were talking about the difference between these two. I did some work in Romania, and Romania is Orthodox. The Orthodox Church is very strong in Romania. And so I got to know the priests in the village, and over the years, I got familiar with the Orthodox rituals and and what I learned, which I thought was such a good solution to celibacy. When a young man wants to give his life to a spiritual life or to the church, he has at some point to make a decision if he wants to be a monk and celibate, or if he wants to be a priest. And if he wants to be a priest, he has to marry.
Okay.
A family. To be a priest in a village or in a city, he has to be a monk. And so they all recommend, and they all so if you don't want to get married, you don't have to, you can be a monk. But then you live not in a parish, you live in a monastery, and you are celibate. But if you are a regular church priest or a city priest, parish priest, you have a family. And I thought, what a smart solution around the issue of celibacy. A man has a choice.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I knew that Eastern Orthodox priests could be married. It just didn't pop into my head when you talk about like the differences. But it sort of reflects the idea that again, they take their beliefs as much as they can from the Bible, and of course the Bible says Peter had a wife, for example. The apostles had wives. There's a passage in there somewhere, one of the letters, where it says, "Let a bishop have no more than one wife," which almost made it sound like you could have more than one wife if you were not a bishop, right? And so they're a little bit more. They've been much less inclined than the Roman Church to sort of create doctrines that don't have any basis in the Bible.
And also, the unhealthy.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we see how we have a terrible story now with this pedophile stuff with the priest and all that. They don't have that issue as much well, at least in Romania, they don't. because the man has a choice, a very clear choice, if he wants to live a monastic life and be celibate, or if he wants to be a priest in community and marry and have children. So I think I have also a question to you, as we are going from century to century, and these same topics reoccur as you are presenting them. Do you think there's something in the collective of our humankind that, I mean, where does in these different centuries and in different corners of the planet, where does the same ideas, either in the East or in the West, where they seem to come up in the consciousness of the collective? And they have maybe a different wording or a different name, but it seems like the collective or the soul of mankind brings it up.
Yeah, that's I kind of think of it as that in every human heart or human soul there is a divine desire to know, to have questions answered, I guess maybe is a way to put it, but to know the divine, to know the source.
Yes.
And
Yes.
because this desire's there, people seek that, and they know they don't find it outwardly, sort of as we read in Augustine's experience. They don't find it in the world around them, that what they're looking for. So they naturally look within and they try different things, and it's as a result they have these experiences. And I think the similarities of the teachings come out of those experiences fundamentally. So that and in fact, one of the interesting things I'll get to a little bit later if we have time, is that even though in these early stages of development, their methods were developed and people pursued the experience, and consequently from their pursuit would have these experiences. I mean, I'm not mentioning anywhere near the totality of all the different mystics there have been in all these different ages. I mean, it's not possible to say how many there were, who they were, and that sort of thing. But one of the things that you see is that in studying this history is that some people don't have any particular discipline; they just have the experience. It sort of comes upon them spontaneously in a moment of quiet reflection or openness. So they haven't followed any particular path, but they have the experience anyway. So I tend to think that the experience is available to everybody. It's within us, and these methods are ways of accessing that. And at the same time, since it's there and waiting for us, it could just come upon us spontaneously without any sort of conscious, intentional practice of a discipline. So that's why I think that's why I think you find the same ideas in all these cases, is that it's something that, as the mystics say, it's something that's already within us. And so we find it in different ways. And maybe the primary thing is just we find it because we deeply desire it at sort of the deepest level. And it comes upon us either through practices or, like I said, sometimes in rare cases, spontaneously. Patty.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe get your take on this. So tonight, after this class, I'm going to go to my center and we're going to talk about contemplation. And Unity, through the Licensed Unity Teacher Path, has given us some guidelines for how to make that happen. But for me, I was like, my weird mystical experiences never happen when I'm sitting on a chair and I'm getting connected to my breath, and that's never the thing. So part of me is like, I really love contemplation, but I can be doing that in the grocery store and not at a Unity center. So I want to be authentic about this contemplation, but I also don't want people to think that they've the world has to be a certain place, or your space has to be a certain way to actually contemplate, because the divine is everywhere.
Right.
So I don't know what your take is on that, but I really love what we're talking about here, and that's what contemplation does for me. Is like, wow, this really is just one thing happening all the time, and it brings tears to my mind all the time. And I think that's why I was drawn to teach this class. But I don't know. I don't want to lead people astray at the same time.
I think, learning these methods of contemplation is a help to discovering sort of deeper reality, or to having these experiences of the divine presence. It's a help to that. And I think it has sort of the contemplation has some of its own sort of benefits beyond, sort of on the way there, I guess you could say. You learn things like how to relax, how to stay calm, and how to not be, thrown out of balance by life conditions. There's various sort of literal physiological benefits for your health in practicing meditation. And sometimes people will, you can have a mystical experience listening to music. You can have a mystical experience while you're dancing. You can have a mystical experience while you're walking through the grocery store, as you put it. I'm going to get to before we close today, and one example of somebody who had a mystical experience just sort of walking home from visiting with people. So, just like one example of a spontaneous experience. So I think it's more about I think this seems maybe a weird way to put it, or simplistic way of putting it, but it has more to do with what your heart is set on than any particular practices. So the practices are kind of an outgrowth of that. Because your heart is set on it, you engage with the practices, and you find them helpful. But we certainly don't want to limit the idea of the divine presence as something that we can only be aware of when we're sitting still and meditating. So I kind of see it as a part of our spiritual journey that we may learn in different from different traditions or whatever. It's an important part of it, but it's not everything, right? Because the divine presence is everywhere. There isn't any reason why you couldn't experience it while you're having a piece of steak or something. I mean, it may not be the most spiritual thing a person can do, but if it's omnipresent, it's omnipresence. What is it? Emerson said, God is omnipresent. Here or nowhere is the fact. Here or nowhere is a fact. So, here, by all means, right, wherever you are. Is that helpful, or is that just?
Yeah, you kind of reminded me that about the both and phenomenon. Like, it is like, for me. I mean, maybe like the beginner in Gregory Palamas is, maybe this is just a beginning technique, but it's just all happening, and maybe it'll be helpful for people, and maybe it won't. But I just I just think it's a both and situation: the practice, yes, and the spontaneous reality of,
yes, I agree,
knowing
100%.
You're in the presence. Yeah.
So it's like, it may be another thing I popped into my head when you're talking about that is music. To play a musical instrument, most people have to be trained, discipline, practice, that sort of thing. But there's a few odd characters out there who just seem to spontaneously be able to play musical instruments. It's not really, I mean, I have no explanation for that, other than that the knowledge is everywhere, and some people tap into it spontaneously, and for some people it takes a little more work. So
for sure.
Yeah, I think it's like that. It's kind of like music. Yeah. Something like that.
Thanks.
Gloria has her hand up.
I know. I was getting to her next. I wanted to finish that. Go ahead, Gloria.
I just wanted to say that even starting from the first class, I was really struck when we talked about the characteristics of mystical experiences and how very similar they are. with what people describe who have had a near-death experience.
Hmm.
They're almost identical, actually. And a lot of, some of those people sure had some kind of a life of where they worship something, whether it didn't have to be, some were agnostic, some were atheists.
Right. Yeah.
They just had that experience. But what it seemed to have done in all the cases is really changed their mind about there being a higher power, and affected them deeply in the way that they have altered their lives and what they're doing. So I wonder if you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I'm very fascinated by near-death experiences, and I agree. They sound like their experience of what we usually call the light, the being of light, or whatever. Their experience of the being of light, when they try to talk about having that experience, is very much the way mystics talk.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's they'll say these words and then they'll say, "But I can't really describe it." So yeah, and I think a key factor just is these experiences do transform people. They do shift their consciousness, and so in that sense, a near-death experience has a lot in common with a mystical experience, and maybe it's the same thing, but experienced a little bit differently, maybe something like that. You don't actually have to leave your body in order to have a mystical experience. Not exactly, right?
Yeah.
Mystics sort of talk about they're not aware of their bodies. It's more likely to be something like that than that they sort of left their bodies. So it's a little bit difference in sequence, but the sort of the total experience itself seems to be described in very similar terms. So that's a really interesting point, Gloria. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay. And who else do we have? Rosemary. Oops, you're muted, Rosemary.
Thank
There
you.
you go.
In response to Gloria, yes, the near-death experiences are definitely a mystical experience. I think many people have mystical experiences that are spontaneous. Like my first one, I was driving my car down the road, and suddenly, I don't know what I did. I think I stopped the car, but I'm not sure. And for me, anyway, and I've also had a couple of near-death experiences, but having experiences of that kind let me know, oh, gee, that was wonderful. I want to be able to do that a lot more often. How do I go to that place? And that was the question I asked myself for a long time. And I have to say that when I was in dire straits, decided, oh, maybe I should meditate. And I actually learned the techniques. What that did for me was it helped my mind to be more quiet more often, so that I have experienced mystical awareness more often and more predictably. And I learned that, oh, gee, that place is in me. I don't have to go anywhere. I can just go within. So but it started out with several spontaneous mystical experiences that I loved so much that I was really motivated to go find them again.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think that really gets much more to the point of what was being asked than what I said, because I think it's like a really perfect example of, okay, what's the value of contemplation, right? And can we have spontaneous experiences and that sort of thing? So thank you for sharing that, Rosemary. I really appreciate it. So I was thinking of something I wanted to say, but it escaped me. So it must not have been important. So we'll just go ahead and move forward unless there's another. I'm going to go to the next slide, because you can just jump in with questions and go back to anything if you want to, but just sort of move ahead a little bit. Oh, I know what I was going to say. That there are all kinds of different spiritual experiences that people can have. Um, William James called varieties of religious experience. There are actually a lot of different shades and types of experiences that connect people to the divine. So in this particular little course that I'm doing, I'm really focusing on one kind of experience, right? And that's sort of recognized, and we have a lot of examples, good examples of it. But it's not the only kind of, it's not the only way people experience the divine. It's simply one sort of tradition and way, and that's interesting. In one way, it's interesting to me because it doesn't. You can see in all these cases, it's not couched in traditional religious language, right? A lot of it's not couched in terms of the traditions, even though these people, most of them, are parts of one tradition or another. And so, um, for example, a mystical experience does not involve a vision of Jesus. A vision of Jesus would be a spiritual experience, or a vision of Mary, whatever. Spiritual would be a religious experience, but it's not the same thing as this kind of experience that we're talking about. It's not inferior or superior. It's just a different way of experiencing the divine. So I'm particularly intrigued by this because this type of experience seems to just cut through all the differences of religion and even non-religion, because some of these people are not particularly affiliated with any religious tradition, and yet they have the same kind of experience. And talk about, it's not only experience, but it's a perspective on the universe. They talk about reality in the same way, right? And kind of in the same way a scientist does. If you ask a scientist to give you a description of reality, they'll give you kind of a scientific physicalist sort of description. If you ask a mystic, no matter which mystic you talk to from whatever tradition or whatever age, they're going to describe, they have the same worldview. They're going to describe reality in the same way. So it's not just experience, it's also a way of perceiving or understanding the cosmos and our relationship to it. So anyway, so this next slide is from in the 14th century. There were a couple of really important, influential books that were written anonymously on mysticism. I don't know why they were written anonymously, but may have something to do with church politics. Who knows? But you do find that also in this tradition, you find anonymous writings that are tremendously influential on later people. And Dionysius is an example of that. And that now suddenly in the 14th century, we find a couple of other ones that are really influential. One from Germany, Theologica Germanica is the name of it, and it reflects the text reflects to a great extent the religion of the religious ideas of the time, but it also has ideas that have much in common with the mystical thread. So I've just pulled one passage that I liked here, rather than trying to sort of go into the whole context and teaching of the Theologica Germanica. I like this one, and that is, I want to say, it's starkly mystical rather than pious or religious in the usual sense. To receive God's commands and his counsel in all his teaching is a privilege of the inward man after he's united with God. And where there is such a union, the outward man is surely taught and ordered by the inward man, so that no outward commandment or teaching is needed. So this idea that what he calls the inward man, what we might call the spiritual man, what we might call the spiritual reality, the Christ within. I don't like to use the word man here, but that's just typical of the language of the time, right? It's the spiritual dimension of our being is already united with God. Here it says after he's united. And of course, what that means is that after we're conscious of that unity, is probably the way to put it, right? Once we become conscious of that divine nature within, that spirituality within, there is this union, so that we don't really need to be taught. We don't really need commandments or teachings, because we're already attuned to this divine within. This attitude has much in common with Taoism, which doesn't rely on rules and regulations, but just seeks to be in the flow of the Tao. It seeks to be Tao-like, right? So I think that's kind of a thing you won't find. You won't find a traditional theologian saying. The traditional theologian will say, well, everybody needs these rules. We have these laws. We have these commandments. We must follow them, and so on and so forth. And for the mystic, they recognize once you are attuned to that which is love, then you don't really need rules, right? The rules are unnecessary because you're acting from that consciousness of wisdom and love that is that you're fundamentally unified with. So that's a rather interesting sort of attitude and statement. So what do you think of that idea? One of the things Augustine had said after his spiritual experiences was that his morality basically could be summarized as love and then do as you wish, right? Because what you wish to do is love, right? And that's sort of the point. So, but what do you think of that? Did you have any thoughts on the need for teachings and outer teachings and outer commandments? Any thoughts on that? I'll just go ahead and move ahead then, because I've got another. Oh, yeah, Diane?
So I guess I bring it back to unity all the time because that's my current experience. But we kind of say, the divine express as us. And we talk about the physical world being changing and not absolute, being relative, but the absolute or our inner world not changing. So it's like once we get our inner world figured out and we accomplish it through meditation, as y'all discussed, then it doesn't matter about the outside. As you said, with love, we'll treat everybody with respect and with dignity and equally. So the outside just falls into place once we have our inner life kind of figured out, is my opinion.
Okay, so you see that as very consistent with what you understand from from unity. Yeah, yeah, I think so too. I think we kind of all sort of get that, and it makes, I think it makes a lot of sense to people when they reflect on it just a little bit, and of course it's easier said than done. It's it's easier to recognize, oh yes, if we only love, then we'll behave well. But it's not that easy to remain centered in love all the time. We as human beings, we have our sort of personal interests and things that come up. So, but I think we all sort of we can get what the meaning of that, even if we don't live every second. But we try as we may. Okay. Go ahead. Somebody else said.
Rosemary, you need to unmute.
Yep, thank you. I wanted to say something about no outward commandment or teaching is needed. I've also worked as a youth minister, and in working with kids of all ages, when you treat them with love and invite them to be loving, they know exactly how to do that. Even if they're troublesome kids, they are not responding to an outward commandment or teaching. They are responding to what is inside them.
Yes, yes. I love that. It's a beautiful insight. I think that's true. One of the things I noticed is kids will say, kids recognize the nature of justice instinctively, right? So they will say things like, well, that's not fair. And when you listen to what they're saying is not fair, they're 99% of the time, they're right,
Yeah, right.
And so they get that without having studied Plato or anything. Amazing.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. I'm going to slide along here a little bit further. Okay, so this is the other famous one. The Theologia Germanica, as I mentioned, was in 14th century in Germany. This one, The Cloud of Unknowing, was written in England, written in English. And this little passage here is just this little piece of that was an important influence on the development of something that you've probably heard of, centering prayer. Any of you ever heard of centering prayer?
Mhm.
It comes right out of this little book on the cloud of unknowing. This is where the idea came from, and which, if you know about centering prayer, you can kind of probably see it in this passage. The cloud of unknowing, the basic idea in this little book is that is similar to what we've seen expressed in different ways in the other traditions, that this experience of the divine is something where we actually have to get past our usual ways of reasoning about things and thinking about things. It doesn't really have anything to do with what we might know or what we might remember or have memorized. It doesn't have anything to do really with our knowledge and our reasoning faculties. It's something beyond that. So we have to get beyond our own sort of human ways of knowing things in order to, in any way, experience the divine in its true nature. And so that's, fundamentally the point of this little book. So the cloud of unknowing is the place where you go to get beyond it. The idea is this cloud of unknowing. You enter into this cloud of unknowing, and that's when you can truly experience God, because you've gotten beyond knowledge, as it's put in some of the other mystical teachings. So this is just a method. Again, we're looking at method that I pulled out of there. Take a little word of one syllable, this word God or this word love. Choose thee that thee think you thee likest best of one syllable, and fasten this word to thine heart. With this word thou shalt beat on this cloud and this darkness above thee. With this word thou shalt smite down all pattern of thought under the cloud of forgetting. So it's just taking this one word, focusing on this one word, concentrating on it, repeating it, impressing it, fastening it to your heart, as it says, that gets you past your sort of reasoning ways. And this is not to denigrate reasoning by any means. It's a very important aspect of being human, but this is about experiencing something beyond our ordinary reasoning. It's about an experience that we know, but can't exactly describe in a way that we can immediately communicate to somebody else, right? So anyway, I just like this idea of the one syllable mantra. Right? You can actually use more than one syllable, but the Cloud of Unknowing recommends this, and I think it's it's a good practice. That's why I used that this morning for our little, or this afternoon for a little meditation. Just try to find that one word. Oh, by the way, I did want to ask: did anybody have any problem getting a word to concentrate on in our opening meditation, or did everybody? Can you just tell me like what you? Well, if you wanted to keep it a secret mantra, that's fine. But would anybody like to share what came to them? Diane?
Mine was love.
This was love. Okay.
Mine was love this week. Last week it was peace.
Peace. Okay.
Yeah.
My own is God is.
God is. Okay. Yeah. Awesome.
Everyness came to my mind.
Everyness. Ooh, I like that. That's like a new word,
It is a
right?
new word.
But it fits. Everyness. Yeah, I love it. Any others? It's more than one syllable, but we'll let that go. Yeah. I love
I
it.
just find that passage interesting because it's kind of like militant meditation.
Yeah. It is. But if you take it in the right spirit, it's very gentle. I mean, I think if you've done enough meditation, you can just think the word love and it'll put you in a meditative state. You just think it once, right? You don't even have to think the word. You can just sort of have the intention. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And like I said, it's kind of the beginning of centering prayer. And I love it because it's so absurdly simple. It's like, you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to know anything really to do this, other than to have some sort of, have had some sort of experience where you loved, for example, or where you felt at peace. If you know what that is, you can just kind of go from there. So um, uh, I like that the most profound experience that a human being can have can be initiated with a single repetition of a single syllable. That's kind of a beautiful thing. Okay. Julian of Norwich, another 14th century one. How am I doing on time? I'm going to kind of skip through some of this stuff fairly quickly now at this point, but feel free again to just start talking if you want to interrupt. Um, just like we're sitting around a table and people interrupt each other. It's fine. So this Julian of Norwich is an English mystic. She's called an anchoress. I don't really understand exactly from the Catholic. I'm not being part of the Catholic tradition exactly what an anchoress is, but she's kind of a sort of a monastic leader, is what I gathered. And anyway, she wrote the first book, published book written by in English by a woman, which I guess is sort of gives her own sort of historical distinction. I believe I'm correct about that. And so she again, sort of typical mystical language, no soul is rested till it is made naught as to all things that are made. So it's again this idea of the idea of nothingness is extremely important in mysticism, both as a description of God and what we seek to do in order to experience God, to become as nothing. It's sort of, what is it? So Jesus said, he who seeks to save his life will lose it, but he who loses his life will save it. Okay. If you look at that from a mystical perspective, you understand exactly what that means. As long as you're grasping onto your notion, actually the word that he uses there actually means is actually soul. It's usually translated as life, but the word psyche, which is almost always translated as soul, except for some reason, I don't want to get into a whole thing about politics of Bible translation. But anyway, Jesus said, he who seeks to save his soul will lose it, but he who loses his soul will save it. If you think of soul as sort of our sense of individual self, separate from or distinct from the universe and distinct from God, that's actually what we want to lose. As the mystic loses all sense of self. So that's that making oneself not, because as long as as long as there's still me and God, there's separation, right? And so that's, in terms of the experience, that's the aim. And so this is the way Julian of Norwich put it. I also like to have her, include her in my list, because she boldly spoke of God as mother as well as father, which when you think about when she's saying that, that's a very sort of bold thing to proclaim. And of course, she justifies it with biblical passages and that sort of thing. What's interesting is she which is kind of traditional, I suppose, but she affiliates associates the idea of the mother aspect of God with wisdom. And if you read like throughout the Bible, wisdom is thought of as feminine. There's not as much mention of it in the New Testament as in the Old, but you get into Proverbs and wisdom is always she and her, right? And so Julian, accepted that idea and sort of worked it into it. But kind of what's most interesting about that is she also talks about Christ as our mother. Christ is our mother. She's talking about Christ as our mother in the context of what is it that a mother does? A mother nurtures, a mother comforts, right? And so Julian thought of, okay, a mother raises us, right? So she thought of Christ as mother in the sense of performing the functions of mother, right? So that part of it's pretty interesting in her writings. And of course, God is nearer to us than our own soul, for he is the ground in whom our soul standeth. In fact, she goes beyond that. I don't have the quote here, but she goes beyond that and says, you can't really know your own soul or your own self until you first know God, because God is the ground of the soul. See? So we can't really know who we are until we know God. To know God is to know ourselves. The idea there, which is something that Phineas Quimby said, by the way. Those of you who are familiar with New Thought history, said, to know God is to know ourselves. I think he's taking sort of the same perspective. A little bit more from Julian. The famous thing where she had a vision. She called them showings. Also in this, he showed me a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut in the palm of my hand. It was as round as a ball. What may this be? And it was answered generally thus: it is all that is made. So I see this as sort of an idea. I love this passage. It's sort of like the idea in relationship to the divine, the whole vast universe is just nothing more than a little this hazelnut that could fit in the palm of your hand. So there's a sort of an imagery there that I like. That's what I think of anyway. I think of this thing that she saw as the whole universe and how small it is compared to the infinite, because everything is small compared to the infinite. Okay. And then she goes on and says it had three properties. God made it, God loved it, God loves it, God keeps it or sustains it. So that's one of her famous visions. Okay. Jump ahead to Nicholas, 15th century.
Before you go any further,
Yes.
isn't it the hazelnut like the great mustard seed?
Yeah, the parable of the mustard seed. Kingdom of God is as a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, and yet it grows into a great mustard tree or mustard bush, right? Yeah. So it could also be, yeah. I think I see what you're saying there. We can also think of that little ball there as the seed from which everything emerges, something like that.
And you only need that much faith, nothing more than
Right.
that, just that grain.
Right. Yeah, that's a good connection. I like that. Thank you. Somebody else have anything before I keep scrolling along here? I don't think I'm going to make it to the 20th century, but it doesn't matter. It's all the same anyway. Okay, so Nicholas of Cusa is famous for his phrase, God is the coincidence or his phrase, coincidence of contradictories, or is sometimes called the coincidence of opposites. And as mystic, this is again that sort of idea that ultimate reality is non-dual, and that in order to and so what keeps us from, in his language here, what the wall of paradise, what keeps us from knowing, experiencing God, is our consciousness of opposites, right? The consciousness of opposition, if we can put it that way, conflict or duality. And so Kusa's, Nicholas of Cusa was a polymath. He was a brilliant theologian, philosopher, mathematician, astronomer. I won't get into all those details, but he's kind of like a really sort of unusual person in his own right. But in his mysticism, he recognized we've got to get, his colorful way of putting it. Thou art I have learnt that the place wherein thou art found unveiled is girt round with the coincidence of contradictories, and this is the wall of paradise wherein thou dost abide. Also makes me think of, how did Adam and Eve get kicked out of paradise in the Bible? Well, they ate of the tree of duality, the knowledge of good and evil. That's what got them kicked out. And so in order to get back in, so to speak, in sort of biblical terms, we have to get beyond our dualistic ways of thinking of things. Right. Oh, sorry. And of course, again, he also refers to God as infinite and absolute infinity. I begin to behold thee unveiled and to enter into the garden of delights. For thou art infinitely and absolutely exalted high above all such things. So again, it's a description he's putting into his words, his language, what his experience is, and how to get there. I guess you might remember that the well, maybe you remember this, maybe you don't, but in the Buddhist Heart Sutra, there was the idea of getting of letting go of dualities, that could be of good and evil, for example, and that's the only way to get at the divine, the all in one and one in all. Um, another woman mystic, Teresa of Avila, 16th century. She's very influential. This is a famous statue of her that kind of uh, reflects a couple of things that she said in her writings about her mystical experiences. I think this is maybe the most colorful one that reflects what's the statue's trying to depict here. She's talking about, and by the way, Teresa's does a very fine analysis of the mystical path and of the path of prayer, where she compares it to gardening and watering your garden in different ways. When you first start practicing contemplation or prayer, it may seem laborious, like carrying buckets of water from a lake or a river. But eventually, as you go along, eventually it becomes easier and easier until it's just like sitting in the rain, right? So she does this lovely little parable of the path and how it becomes easier and easier and more pleasant, this path of contemplation. But anyway, so here's her description. While seeking God in this way, the soul becomes conscious that it is fainting almost completely away in a kind of swoon. So you see the image of the statue, she's swooning with an exceeding great and sweet delight. You can apprehend nothing with the senses, which only hinder his soul's joy. So again, it's an experience beyond our sensory perceptions and a loss of self, which she describes as the soul as a kind of swoon or fainting. So I kind of like that description, and so you get what the sort of the meaning that's being portrayed here in this famous statue. John of the Cross was kind of Teresa of Avila was his mentor. Well, he's one of the, again, famous Catholic mystic, and I wanted to show you this. You can kind of read what the slide there says. It's from John of the Cross. But I want to put these pictures on here. The top picture is a drawing. So John of the Cross did various drawings, and it's very unique in its time. It depicts the crucifixion from above. Ordinarily, it's either below or kind of straight on. He's got this idea of viewing it from above as having. It's almost suggestive of being in the. This is the way I interpret it. It's just an interpretation. Being in the Christ consciousness that sees the human and human suffering from above, as if it's risen above that, right? It's viewing it from a higher perspective. And so the picture below that is a Salvador Dali, famous Salvador Dali painting, which clearly is imitative of John's drawing there. So I just thought that was kind of interesting to me. And I just like this particular passage. I think it's essential mysticism. That soul that has greater communion with God which is most advanced in love. The mystics, I haven't done a lot of quotations about love, but if you read the mystical writings, they all sort of put love as the starting place and the ending place, in a way, of mysticism, that sets one's heart, the love in one's heart, on God in order to experience God, that is sort of having that more transcendent experience of love. So the morality of mysticism is rooted in love, but so is the idea of contemplation and experience of God. So it's not something just that we feel, but something that we live out from having that knowing, that experience. How am I doing on time here? I guess okay. Let's see. So this is we go to a different tradition here. Jacob Boehme or Jacob Boehme is another name, that the way the name's pronounced and spelled, 16th century. So now we have kind of our first Lutheran mystic, our first Protestant mystic. We've been looking at Eastern Orthodox, Catholic. He had a tremendous influence on what's called esoteric Christianity, esoteric spirituality. He wrote a number of books. One of them was called Christian Theosophy, and that's where the Theosophists got their name, from the study of his word theosophy, which means God wisdom. In fact, he didn't really invent that word. It was used in early Christian writings, but it didn't come much to the surface until here in this Protestant era, when Boehme writes about it. And he had some very sort of colorful ways of talking about the divine that are different. And I won't get into all of that, but we'll just sort of focus on here a couple of sayings that, again, typical of that mystical thread. Thou standest still from the thinking and willing of self. The eternal hearing, seeing, and speaking will be revealed to thee, and so God heareth and seeth through thee. Okay, so this is again that idea described variously as surrender, abandonment, losing oneself in God, and so on. Right? And when thou art gone forth wholly from the creature, okay, so again, it's a consciousness beyond our humanness, and art become nothing to all that is nature. There's that language, becoming not, becoming nothing, right? To all that is nature and creature, then thou art in that eternal one, which is God himself. And then thou shalt perceive and feel the highest virtue of love. And so we come back to love. In just these couple of passages, we see sort of some of the essential ideas in mysticism, now expressed in the Netherlands, actually, was where Boehm is originally from, in the 1600s, right? George Fox, founder of the Quakers, and similar kinds of ideas. But the main thing we get from Fox is the sitting in the silence, right? The Christians now following George Fox, the Quakers, Society of Friends, a big part of what they do is just sitting in the silence and waiting on the Spirit, waiting on the inner light, which Fox says is in everyone. We've all got this inner light to teach us. So again, it's the inner teacher. Take heed to the light within you, which, as you love it, will call your minds inward. So again, there's the inwardness, and so on. And mind the light of God in your consciences. So Fox, of course, is not only an important, I guess you'd say, religious leader, but, to a great extent, he influenced the whole idea of uh, prayer in the silence, which we find in New Thought, and also ideas of civil disobedience, okay, that we more associate with Thoreau, because he sort of talked about the principles of it, but his idea of civil disobedience is completely consistent with Fox. Fox spent a fair amount of time in jail because he refused to do things like tip his hat to somebody who was of a higher caste, like a lord or a noble person. Supposed to tip your hat in England in that time. He wouldn't do it, and so they put him in jail. The Quakers, following Fox, refused to swear an oath, right? So if you went to court and they'd expect you to swear an oath, you wouldn't do it. So you get in jail for that. Why? Because Jesus said, swear not. Okay, it's right out of like the Sermon on the Mount and so on. So very interesting individual in terms of social change and in terms of bringing a deeper mysticism and spirituality into the Protestant tradition. Mm-hmm. Oh, one of my favorites. I actually talked about Madame Guillen in connection with the Golden Key talk that I gave about Emmett Fox. You might recall Madame Guillen, and I talked about her in that Sunday talk. She well, I won't say any more about it. Just that her idea of that our main purpose is to sit in the silence and contemplate the divine presence. So a lot of the priests in her time found that objectionable. They call it quietism, and they consider that to be heretical in some sense. So she, like Fox, spent some time in jail as well, but had a tremendous influence nonetheless. And she said this again, this fundamental idea among Christian mystics. The most important thing is the kingdom of God is not something that's going to happen in the future, but it's something that's within us. And the Christian mystics get that, even if the traditional church has often sort of overlooked that little bit of truth from Jesus. Okay. The idea of abandonment, well, as I said, you can go back and watch the video on YouTube of the talk if you want to know more about Madame Guillen. I'm going to kind of skip over her a little bit, okay? Because we get to Ramakrishna, who's 19th century considered by many, certainly by his followers, to be a god incarnation akin to Krishna or Rama, an avatar. That's part of the Hindu tradition. Quite an interesting character. One of the things that I found sort of fascinating about him was that he could spend hours in a yogic position and something like standing on one leg, one of those yoga positions. I don't know what they call it because I'm not a yogi. And he could do that for hours in a trance state. I mean, people observed it. They sat there and kind of watched him. Actually, it's kind of weird. There's pictures of him doing that. So he obviously was a person who was profoundly adept at meditation, I guess is maybe a way of putting it. But he wrote that this sort of reflects not only Krishna, but the movement in Hinduism that emerged out of his teachings, which is called Vedanta. So if any of you are familiar with the Vedanta Society or Swami Vivekananda, his writings, I mean that comes out of Ramakrishna's teachings. But one of the things he said is the beatific godly vision occurs only in the heart which is calm and wrapped in divine communion. So the physical activity can be something that we might be involved with in having a spiritual experience, but he really believed that it's the inner calmness that is the key to that. Different creeds, but different paths to reach the same God, which Maya reminds us every Sunday morning with her candle lighting ceremony. And when divine vision is attained, all appear equal. There remains no distinction of good and bad or high and low. So again, beyond duality. I wanted to do one more, and then I'm going to stop. And this is, maybe you've read the book or heard of the book, Cosmic Consciousness. It's kind of a book. It's a book by this Canadian psychiatrist named Richard Buck, and he had a whole theory of psychology and how we're evolving towards what he called the cosmic consciousness, which is basically the mystical perspective. So he goes all through history, kind of like I've done in this course, and talks about these different people who've had the experience of cosmic consciousness and what that means, not only in terms of the experience, but in practical terms and transformation of the personality. So it's quite, it's a book that's quite relevant to understanding, the evolution of human consciousness and how ultimately we'll all be mystics sooner or later. That's sort of part of his theory. But anyway, he's describing here his own experience. And the context of it was he was having a conversation with some friends about spiritual things. It was, I believe Walt Whitman was one of the people that was there that evening, as I recall. But in any case, he was just on his way home, right? But he was in this, what he describes as state of mind. So he's walking, okay? He's walking as this happens. I was in a state of quiet, almost passive enjoyment, not actually thinking, but letting ideas, images, and emotions flow of themselves, as it were, through my mind. All at once, without warning of any kind, I found myself wrapped in a flame-colored cloud. I knew that the fire was within myself. Directly afterward, there came upon me a sense of exaltation or immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination impossible to describe. So he's clearly had this mystical experience walking home from a conversation with a group of like-minded spiritual friends, and all of a sudden thing just sort of happened. So it's an example of a spontaneous mystical experience. He describes a number of those in the book Cosmic Consciousness, that people had these sort of spontaneous experiences. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to jump past some of the folks and just get to the conclusions so we can close, because I realize I'm running a little past time here. Mysticism, this is sort of conclusions we can draw. They aren't the only conclusions, but they are some that I think are significant. Mysticism is a quest to experience union with ultimate reality. So it's a quest as well as an experience. The path to experience may be disciplined or spontaneous, right? Which we've seen the different traditions. Mystical experience is partly emotional and partly intellectual. So what I mean by that, William James described it as noetic. There's some kind of insight into the nature of the universe. Many of the mystics write about in detail in their mystical teachings, their perspective on the nature of the universe. So there's an intellectual dimension to it, something that can involve an expression of different kinds of concepts, but it's also fundamentally an experience of peace or love or bliss or joy described in various ways. So it's something that sort of combines those two sort of fundamental aspects of soul, thought and feeling. The mystical experience seems out of time. In other words, there's no sense of time, out of space. So there's no sense of space even, and even out of body, right? The mystical experience is something, maybe the simplest way to say is out of the ordinary, right? Out of our ordinary world into another dimension of consciousness. And so the mystical experience transcends ordinary perceptions and concepts, hence can be described as infinite or nothingness, because we can't really say what infinity is. We also can't say what nothingness is. So we saw some of that in the various expressions. So that's a conclusion of this series. Other than I realize I ran a little over time. I apologize for that. It's hard for me to get everything in. But if anyone had any comments or questions or thoughts that you want to share before everyone leaves, feel free to do that. Well, thanks for the thumbs up. I appreciate that.
I loved it. I really would like to rope you rope you in to do something more. Would there be interest in May? At the same time, 5 o'clock on Wednesday, and we can talk about it.
I could do something a little more focused, maybe just on a few mystical texts, but going more into the ideas rather than just sort of repeating, showing how they repeat themselves, I guess.
I would be interested in finishing the list.
Oh, list that I had. yeah, I mean,
the 19th and 20th centuries. That would be great.
Well, I could do something like, focusing on more recent mystics, maybe. That might be a way to go. Mysticism in the 19th through 21st century or something like that.
Yeah, very good.
There you go.
I also wanted to thank you all. You have all been sending us your love offering and being gracious and generous with us. And I really appreciate any amount that you contribute. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for continuing to practice the unity teaching of giving and receiving and letting yourself be in the flow. So, and I know it's my job to say something about money and love offerings. And yeah, that's right. So anyway, and just enjoyed this tremendously. So if any of you, I think I know all of you. I have Patty, I got Diane, I got Brendalyn, and of course I got Marjorie and Gloria and Rosemary. So I think I have everybody that I make a little sub list for myself. I will let you know. This would be after Easter. In the meantime, we are blessed to have James continue and Rosemary to speak on Sunday, rotating. And so make sure, are you all on my e-bulletin, my weekly e-bulletin?
I'm not.
Can you send me can you all send me an email so I can put you on and I don't have to scramble right now? It's just maya.brandenberger@icloud.com. Or you can send it to Unity of Montreal, Unity Center of Montreal @gmail.
Just type your email address into the chat stream, and then we'll just leave it up for a while, and they can copy it right out of there.
How do I do that? Up at the top?
Chat.
Click on chat.
You have to click on more, I think, where the three little dots are at the bottom, and then that brings up the chat thing. See it?
More, yes. And then pause.
Patty already put it in.
Oh, there you go. Thanks, Patty.
Woo, I'm so pleased when I have people who are helpful. Okay. Thank you so much. Maya
Thank you for the opportunity.
at iCloud.com with an M.
Oh, I want to put in a plug for Rosemary. She does the little French service after the Sunday service. I've so much. When I come in on Sunday, I stay for that. I love, even though my French is less than minimal. She puts things up on the screen, and I recognize some of the. I sort of sometimes get what she's saying, but it's beautiful language, and get to do the Lord's Prayer in French, and
Right.
it's a delightful experience, even if you don't speak French.
That's right. And Rosemary and I are working on a flyer to do something by the Golden Key in French, a discussion group. And so when we are ready, when we have really gotten it together, we're going to put it out, and everybody, who's Francophone or French speaking. So this is happening. We just are. The province of Quebec is bilingual, and we feel like we want to honor our bilingual heritage.
So you're doing a French translation of The Golden Key by Emmett Fox? Is that?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's great. That's great. You can print a bunch of those off and put them in bus stations and stuff. It's like they did in the old days.
And we got a network, a monthly network with Sandra Miot, who is Haitian, and she's connected to people in Martinique and the French Caribbean, and Rosemary has people in Paris, and I have people in Switzerland, and so we're looking at putting whatever material we have in French to put it out. Yeah,
and Africa and Asia too.
And so we have we're starting to do some international stuff.
Beautiful, yeah.
Unity Montreal.
And I know that in American Unity congregations, there are people who know French and who'd love the opportunity to practice.
Ah, yeah.
Like me, I grew up in Ontario. So I know some
go.
French.
Probably people in Nolens. Probably people in Nolens who speak French.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Spanish-speaking people in Unity churches.
Right. Yeah, we just found out
in the United States, but also South America and Central America.
Yeah. Well, we have a goodbye hug. Reach across the screen and see if you can feel hands on both sides. Either hand is holding a hand. The light of God surrounds us. The love
of God enfolds us.
The power
of God protects us.
And the presence of God
watches over us.
Wherever
we are,
God
is, and all is well.
And so, ladies and Gwendolyn, you have safe journey. Safe journey.
Yes. Have a great time.
And send me the information on this Unity Center outside of Guadalajara. Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.
It's wonderful to be with you all, really. Studer, Gmail, Diane Studer. Okay.